Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Routine compliance check. I need to see your license and proof of legal status. I'm Lieutenant Commander Nancy Kelly, United States Navy. My military ID and common access card are right here. We've heard all kinds of things at these checkpoints. I need proof of citizenship. Something more than that. I am handing you a federally issued military identification card. I am an active-duty naval officer. I was born in San Antonio, Texas. Call Naval Air Station Jacksonville and they will verify my identity in under 2 minutes. Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. I am not stepping out of this vehicle without cause. There is no probable cause for this stop. I am complying. I am not resisting. And this dashcam has been recording since you reached my window. The 2-lane highway outside Jacksonville, Florida was the kind of road that doesn't make maps worth mentioning, flat, tree-lined, the afternoon light falling long and gold across the asphalt in the particular way it does in North Florida when the summer hasn't quite decided to let go of the day. The American flag and the Texas state flag flew from a pole near the checkpoint shoulder, snapping in the warm wind, framed in the upper corner of Nancy Kelly's dashcam like an image someone had composed deliberately to make a point. She had been 12 minutes from home. What started as a routine immigration checkpoint stop, one masked ICE agent, a gloved hand extended toward a driver's window, would become a 2-hour and 17-minute roadside detention of a decorated United States Navy lieutenant commander, captured in full on dashcam footage and a body camera that the agent apparently forgot was recording. A federal lawsuit that the government tried to settle twice. And a $15.6 million verdict that established new constitutional precedent for the protection of active-duty military personnel at immigration checkpoints, and made Agent Marcus Webb the most expensive traffic stop in Florida naval history. If you believe that a woman who swore an oath to defend the Constitution deserves to have it applied to her, like this video and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. And if this is your first time here, subscribe right now, because tomorrow's story involves the wrong person getting underestimated in a very permanent way, and you are not going to want to miss it. Nancy Kelly was 36 years old and she had been defending this country since she was 22, which meant she had spent more than a third of her life operating inside institutions that required her to prove herself continuously, without complaint, at a standard that shifted depending on who was doing the measuring. She knew this about the Navy the way she knew the feel of her own hands on a steering wheel, not bitterly, not naively, but accurately, in the way that people who have navigated complex systems for a long time develop a kind of precise and unsentimental cartography of exactly where the walls are. She had been born in San Antonio, Texas, the 4th generation of her family to serve in the U.S. military and the first woman in that line to reach officer rank. Her great-grandfather had served in Korea. Her grandfather had done 2 tours in Vietnam and come home to a country that treated his service as a footnote. Her father had retired as a master sergeant from the Army after 22 years and told Nancy, on the day she received her commission, that the uniform would open some doors and close others and that the job was to learn which was which and never mistake one for the other. She had taken that advice and built a career on it. 12 years at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. 2 overseas deployments. A Meritorious Service Medal. A security clearance that had required a federal background investigation so thorough it took 8 months to complete. A spotless service record that her commanding officer had described, in her last performance review, as the kind of career that made the institution look better than it deserved to. She also, and this was the part that Agent Marcus Webb could not have known, standing at her window on a Florida highway with his gloved hand extended, held dual postgraduate degrees in constitutional law and international military law. She had completed them over 3 years of night coursework and deployment hour study, online modules opened on a laptop between watches, casebooks read in the 20-minute windows between briefings. She had told almost no one. Not because she was ashamed of it, but because she had watched, over 12 years of active duty, how quickly a black woman who displayed too much credentialed ambition found the room temperature change around her, and she had made the strategic decision that her law degrees were a loaded weapon she would carry quietly until the day she needed to use them. That Saturday afternoon, driving home from the base in her black SUV, green t-shirt, long hair loose, a Navy base decal on her rear window and a Texas plate that had never once been questioned in 12 years of driving in Florida, Nancy was not thinking about constitutional law. She was thinking about the leftover groceries she needed to pick up before the commissary closed, and a report she wanted to finish before Monday, and the particular quality of the late afternoon light on the highway that she had always found, without being able to explain it, genuinely beautiful. She saw the checkpoint ahead and slowed. She saw the agent step toward her window and registered his gear, tactical vest, ice patch, dark mask obscuring his face below the helmet, with the automatic cataloging instinct of someone trained to assess what was in front of her before it reached her. She reached for her military ID before he got there. She had her common access card and her Texas driver's license ready in her hand. He reached her window. He looked at her. He asked for proof of legal status. Nancy Kelly looked at the American flag and the Texas flag snapping in the wind above the checkpoint, the flags she had taken an oath in front of, the flags her family had served under for 4 generations, and she handed over her credentials with both hands and kept her voice at the register she used when she needed to be perfectly clear and leave no room for misinterpretation. Agent Webb looked at what she handed him. Then he asked for something else. The dashcam was already recording. It would not stop for 2 hours and 17 minutes. And when it was done recording, it would contain everything anyone needed to understand exactly what had happened on that road, under those flags, to a woman who had spent 12 years defending the country that just stopped her to ask whether she belonged in it. The agent had stopped the wrong car. He was about to spend the next 18 months finding out precisely how wrong. Before the checkpoint, there was the career. And before the career, there was the decision, made at 22 years old in a commissioning ceremony in San Antonio, Texas, standing in a room full of family who had worn uniforms before her and understood, without needing it explained, what she was walking into and what she was walking away from, and that the two things were not always separable. Naval Air Station Jacksonville had been Nancy Kelly's professional home for 12 years. She knew its rhythms the way you know the rhythms of a place you have invested yourself in completely, the particular quality of its mornings, the specific sounds of the flight line at 0500, the way the base settled into itself on Sunday afternoons when the operational tempo dropped and the institution became, briefly, something that resembled ordinary life. She had arrived as an ensign with a commission, a duffel bag, and a family history of military service that she wore not as a burden but as a framework, a set of standards established by people who had done harder things in worse conditions and asked for less in return, and whose example she measured herself against every single day. 12 years had produced a service record that her commanding officer, Captain Elaine Marsh, kept in a mental file she described to colleagues as the kind of career you pointed junior officers toward when they asked what sustained excellence actually looked like in practice. 2 overseas deployments, both completed without incident and both commended in her performance reviews for the specific quality of her leadership under operational pressure. A meritorious service medal awarded after her second deployment for actions that the citation described in careful military language that nonetheless conveyed, to anyone who read it closely, that Nancy had made a series of correct decisions under conditions that would have caused less prepared officers to make the wrong ones. Her security clearance was the kind that took 8 months to obtain and required a federal background investigation thorough enough to surface anything in a person's history that the government considered relevant to questions of loyalty, reliability, and judgment. It had surfaced nothing. Because there was nothing to surface. Nancy Kelly was, by every measurable federal standard, exactly what her common access card said she was, a trusted, decorated, thoroughly vetted officer of the United States Navy, cleared to access information that the government protected with considerable institutional energy. None of this was what Agent Marcus Webb had been thinking about when he stepped to her window. But it was everything she had been carrying. The law degrees were a different category of thing. Not classified, not secret in any formal sense, but kept private with the specific deliberateness of someone who has learned to manage the distance between what they are capable of and what an institution is prepared to allow them to display. Nancy had started the coursework in her 9th year of active duty, after an encounter with a base legal officer who had explained a constitutional rights issue to her incorrectly, confidently, and with the particular tone of a man who had no reason to imagine she might know the difference. She had gone home that evening and looked up the case he had cited. He had cited it wrong. She enrolled in the program 6 weeks later. Dual concentration, constitutional law and international military law, delivered through a combination of online coursework and a weekend residency program at a law school in Tampa whose partnership with the Department of Defense allowed active duty personnel to complete graduate legal degrees without separating from service. She told Captain Marsh because operational transparency required it and because Marsh was the kind of commanding officer who responded to the information by saying, simply, good, and asking no further questions. She told her sister in San Antonio because her sister had watched their father work himself quietly into the margins of an institution that never fully saw him, and Nancy wanted someone in her family to know she had decided to do something different with that inheritance. She told no one else. The coursework happened in the hours that active duty life left unclaimed, night watches, deployment downtime, the 45 minutes before reveille when the base was quiet enough to read case law without interruption. Constitutional doctrine. Military jurisdiction. Civil rights litigation frameworks. The specific intersection of federal authority and individual protection that the Fourth Amendment had been constructed to govern and that the courts had spent 2 centuries arguing about in language that Nancy found, once she understood it fluently, both precisely crafted and routinely ignored by the people most obligated to apply it. She graduated summa cum laude. She sat for the bar exam on a Tuesday in October, drove back to base the same evening, and stood her next watch the following morning without telling anyone where she had been. The results came back 6 weeks later. She had passed on the first attempt. She filed the certificate in the same drawer where she kept her deployment orders and her service medal citation and her commissioning photograph, the artifacts of a career built in layers, each one added to the previous without announcement, without fanfare, without asking the institution for permission to become more than it had budgeted for her. She had kept it private not out of shame, there was nothing in the degrees to be ashamed of, and she knew that, but out of the careful arithmetic that black women in institutions perform when they understand that capability and acceptability are not the same currency, and that the second can be depleted by too visible a display of the first. She had watched colleagues, women, particularly, and black women especially, accumulate credentials and find the accumulation used against them in the language of ambition, of overreach, of not knowing their place in a hierarchy that had not been designed with them in mind. She had decided to be patient. To carry the degrees the way her great-grandfather had carried his dignity through Korea, quietly, completely, with the knowledge that the moment would come when the carrying would matter and that when it came, she would be ready. The 2-lane highway outside Jacksonville on a Saturday afternoon was not the moment she had imagined. But it was the moment she got. And she was, as it turned out, entirely ready. His name was Marcus Webb and he moved with the particular confidence of someone who had done this enough times that it had stopped requiring thought. That was the first thing Nancy registered about him, not the IC vest, not the tactical gear, not the gloved hand that came up in the universal gesture of stop as she slowed toward the checkpoint, but the quality of his attention, or rather the absence of it. He was not alert. He was routine. He approached her window the way someone approaches a task they have performed so many times that the performance has become entirely mechanical, the decision already made before the engagement begins, the outcome assumed before the evidence is examined. Nancy had spent 12 years around people trained to assess threats, and she understood the difference between genuine vigilance and its bureaucratic imitation. Webb was running a script. She was a variable the script had not anticipated. She had her credentials ready before he reached her door. Military Common Access card on top, Texas driver's license beneath it, both held out through the open window in a single clear offering, the practiced gesture of someone who understood that deliberate visibility was its own form of protection. That keeping her hands where he could see them and her movements slow and legible was the first layer of a documentation strategy she had begun assembling the moment she saw the checkpoint ahead. Webb took the cards. He looked at them with the brief, scanning attention of someone performing verification rather than conducting it, the difference between looking at something and reading it. The Common Access card carried her name, her rank, her branch of service, her photograph, a Department of Defense seal, and a federal chip encoding her security clearance status. It was, by any objective measure, the most thoroughly vetted form of identification the United States government issued to individuals who had passed the kind of background investigation that took 8 months and left no stone unexamined. He handed it back and asked for proof of citizenship. Nancy took a breath that was not audible on the dashcam audio, though she was aware of it internally, the specific breath of a person who has just confirmed that the situation is exactly what they feared it was and must now decide, in real time, how to proceed. She had constitutional law fluent in her mind the way some people have music, not as an abstraction but as a living, applicable framework, immediately accessible and directly relevant to what was happening at her window on a Florida highway on a Saturday afternoon. She spoke clearly, at a register calibrated for the dashcam microphone, each word deliberate and unambiguous. She stated her full name and rank. Lieutenant Commander Nancy Kelly, United States Navy. She stated her station, Naval Air Station Jacksonville. She stated her place of birth, San Antonio, Texas, January 9, 1988. She stated that she had just presented federally issued military identification bearing her photograph, her name, her rank, and her Department of Defense credentials, and that this identification had been issued following a federal background investigation of several months' duration. She stated that there was no probable cause for additional documentation demands, that a request for proof of citizenship beyond federally issued military identification lacked legal basis under established Fourth Amendment precedent, and that she wished to note for the record that she was complying fully with the stop while formally objecting to its legal foundation. She said all of this in the tone she used during operational briefings, not hostile, not theatrical, but precise in the way that precision becomes its own form of authority when the person using it understands exactly what they are describing and exactly why it matters. Webb's expression, what she could read of it above the mask, shifted in a way that she catalogued as discomfort rather than reconsideration. He was not reconsidering. He was recalibrating, moving from the assumption that this would be routine to the recognition that it was not going to be routine, without yet understanding what that meant for him personally and professionally. He told her to wait. He stepped back from the window and keyed his radio. Nancy kept her hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, visible and still, and looked straight ahead through the windshield at the two-lane road that continued north toward Jacksonville and home and the leftover groceries and the report she had planned to finish before Monday. The American flag and the Texas flag moved in the afternoon wind at the edge of her peripheral vision, not quite in her direct sightline, but present, the way certain things are present at moments that will later be described and analyzed and argued over in federal court. The backup unit arrived 11 minutes later. A second agent, younger, who took a position near the rear of her SUV and did not speak. Webb returned to her window and informed her that her documentation was being verified and that she was required to remain at the checkpoint until the process was complete. Nancy asked, calmly and for the record, what specific legal authority governed the requirement that she remain, whether a judicial warrant existed for her detention, and what probable cause had been established to justify the stop in the first instance. Webb did not answer any of these questions. He stepped back again. Nancy sat with her hands on the wheel and the dashcam rolling and the flags moving behind her and thought, with the focused clarity of a constitutional lawyer who was also a naval officer who was also a black woman alone on a rural Florida highway, about every case she had studied in Tampa on Saturday mornings with coffee going cold beside her laptop. She thought about the specific intersection of authority and accountability, about the difference between power exercised and power justified, about the long tradition of people who had sat in stationary vehicles on American roads and been asked to prove something that should never have required proof. She thought about her great-grandfather. She thought about her father's advice about knowing which doors the uniform opened and which it closed. She thought about the bar certificate in the drawer at home beside her service medal. She did not reach for her phone. She did not raise her voice. She did not give Agent Marcus Webb a single frame of footage that could be used to characterize her as anything other than what she was, a decorated naval officer, a United States citizen, sitting with her hands visible on a steering wheel, waiting for a system to finish failing her so she could begin the work of making it answer for that failure. 2 hours and 17 minutes. The sun moved. The flags moved. The dashcam recorded all of it. When the second agent finally approached her window and told her she was free to go, no explanation offered, no acknowledgement of error, no word that resembled an apology, Nancy thanked him in the same level tone she had used throughout, pulled her credentials from where she had placed them on the passenger seat, and drove the remaining 12 minutes home in a silence that was not emptiness but preparation. She was already thinking about which attorney to call. She got home at 6:23 p.m. She knew this because she noted it, the time, the mileage, the specific quality of the light when she pulled into her driveway, with the methodical instinct of someone who understood that documentation was not a reaction to what had happened but a discipline that had to begin before the memory started softening the edges of things. She sat in the driveway for 4 minutes before going inside. Not from shock, Nancy Kelly did not process things through shock, had trained that out of herself years ago, but from the need to complete the mental inventory she had been compiling for 2 hours and 17 minutes on the shoulder of a Florida highway. Every exchange. Every request. Every non-answer to every direct legal question. The timestamps she had noted mentally against the dashcam's running clock. The precise language Webb had used, and more importantly the language he had not used, the absence of probable cause articulation, the absence of judicial warrant reference, the absence of any legally coherent framework for what he had done. She ran through it the way she ran through post-deployment debriefs, chronologically, without editorializing, focused entirely on what had occurred rather than what she felt about what had occurred. There would be time for the second thing. The first thing needed to be preserved exactly as it was before anything else touched it. She went inside. She made tea she didn't drink. She opened her laptop and began writing. By the time she went to bed that night, she had 11 pages of time-stamped notes organized by constitutional category: Fourth Amendment stops and seizures, probable cause requirements, the specific federal statutes governing immigration checkpoint authority and their limitations, the case law most directly applicable to what Webb had done and failed to do at each stage of the encounter. She wrote it in the precise, citation-ready language of a legal memorandum rather than a personal account, because she understood that personal accounts were vulnerable to characterization and legal memoranda were not. She called Diane Osei on Monday morning, 71 hours after the checkpoint. Diane was 44 years old, a civil rights attorney based in Jacksonville whose practice had been built specifically at the intersection of military law and constitutional rights, a niche carved out of 15 years of watching the two systems interact in ways that rarely favored the individual over the institution. She had been recommended by Captain Marsh, who had made the call to Nancy on Sunday evening after Nancy sent her a brief message that said only, "I need a referral." Civil rights. Federal. Marsh had not asked for details. She had sent Diane's number with a single line: "She is the best person for this. Call her tomorrow." Diane reviewed the dashcam footage the same afternoon Nancy sent it. She called back within the hour. She told Nancy what Nancy already knew, that the stop was legally indefensible, that the dashcam footage was the kind of evidence that made government legal teams nervous in the specific way that irrefutable documentation makes people nervous when they are on the wrong side of it, and that the case had the structural elements of a significant federal civil rights action. She asked Nancy what outcome she was looking for. Nancy told her she wanted accountability. Not the private kind, not a settlement with a confidentiality agreement that allowed the agency to file the incident away as a resolved matter and change nothing. The public kind. The kind that required the government to sit in a courtroom and explain, on the record, what legal authority Agent Marcus Webb had believed he was exercising on that highway, and why a federally issued military identification bearing a Department of Defense seal had been insufficient documentation of citizenship for a woman who had spent 12 years serving the country that issued it. Diane said, "Then we file and we don't settle." Nancy said, "We file and we don't settle." The lawsuit was filed 3 weeks later. The charges were precise and documented with the thoroughness of someone who had been building the case in real time from the moment Webb reached her window: unlawful detention, Fourth Amendment violation, racial profiling, deprivation of civil rights under color of federal authority, and a specific count related to the military status of the detained individual that Diane had argued successfully in 2 prior cases and that Nancy had identified herself from her international military law coursework on the night she wrote her 11 pages of notes. The government's first settlement offer arrived 6 weeks after filing. $75,000, full release of claims, comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. Nancy read it once and did not respond. Not because she was considering it and taking time to decide, but because she felt the offer did not merit the dignity of a formal refusal. Diane sent a 1-line acknowledgement noting receipt. Nothing further. Discovery began in the fall. The government's legal team received the dashcam footage, Webb's body camera footage, the checkpoint's administrative logs, and Nancy's 11 pages of contemporaneous notes organized by constitutional category. The second settlement offer arrived 4 weeks into discovery. $300,000, same NDA terms. Diane called to present it as she was professionally obligated to do. Nancy asked her how long she thought the trial preparation would take. Diane said 6 months. Nancy said, "Tell them no." The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday in January. Nancy arrived in civilian clothes, deliberately, specifically civilian clothes, a decision she had made after consideration and rejected twice before settling on it as correct, because she wanted the record to reflect that she was there as a private citizen whose rights had been violated, not as a naval officer whose institutional identity might be used to reframe the encounter as something other than what it was. The government's lead attorney was a man named Hargrove. He was thorough, well-prepared, and operating, Nancy recognized within the first 10 minutes, under a fundamental misapprehension about who was sitting across the table from him. He had reviewed her service record. He had not reviewed anything else. He began, 40 minutes into the deposition, to explain the legal framework governing immigration checkpoint stops. He cited the relevant Supreme Court precedent. He described the balancing test the court had established for weighing government interest against individual liberty at fixed checkpoints. He did this in the patient, somewhat elevated tone of an attorney explaining technical material to someone he has assessed as unlikely to be familiar with it. Nancy let him finish the citation. Then she said, in the same level register she had used on the highway, that she was familiar with that case, and with the subsequent circuit court decisions that had refined its application, and with the specific provisions of federal statute governing the limits of immigration enforcement authority at highway checkpoints, and with the constitutional military law framework that created additional protections for active duty personnel in precisely these circumstances. She informed him that she held dual postgraduate degrees in constitutional law and international military law from an accredited institution, that she had passed the bar examination, and that during the 2 hours and 17 minutes she had spent on the shoulder of a Florida highway she had been mentally documenting each violation as it occurred against the relevant legal standard in real time. She said, "Would like to proceed." The deposition room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when the actual shape of a situation becomes visible to everyone present simultaneously. Hargrove looked at her. His co-counsel looked at Diane. Diane looked at nothing in particular, her expression carrying the composed neutrality of someone who had known this moment was coming and had been looking forward to it for several months. Hargrove recovered. He was professional enough for that. But the quality of his questions changed after that moment, became more careful, more precise, more aware of exactly who was on the other side of the table, and Nancy answered each one with the same unhurried accuracy she had maintained throughout, building the record one question at a time, document by document, citation by citation, toward a courtroom where the full weight of what she had been carrying quietly for 12 years would finally be set down in public and allowed to be seen. She had deliberated about the dress whites. Not for long. Nancy Kelly was not a person who spent excessive time on decisions once the relevant considerations had been properly weighed, but she had sat with the question for 2 evenings before arriving at the answer. The civilian clothes at the deposition had been the correct choice for the correct reason. She had needed the record to reflect her standing as a private citizen. The courtroom required something different. Not performance, she had no interest in performance, but accuracy. She was a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy who had been stopped on a public road and treated as a suspect in the country she served. The full truth of what had been violated required the full truth of who had been violated. The dress whites were the full truth. She walked into the federal courthouse in Jacksonville on a March morning with her service medals in their proper order and her bearing carrying the 12 years of discipline that had produced them, and the courtroom, packed with naval personnel in uniform, community members, journalists, and 2 rows of faces she recognized as civil rights attorneys who had come to watch the case that their colleagues had been discussing since the deposition transcript circulated, registered her entrance in the specific way that rooms register the arrival of someone who understands that presence is its own argument. Diane Osei had structured the case the way a good architect structures a building, foundation first, then the load-bearing elements, then the details that made the whole thing coherent and inevitable. She opened with the dashcam footage. She played it synchronized with Webb's body camera, 2 simultaneous angles on the same 2 hours and 17 minutes, displayed side by side on a courtroom screen so that the jury could see the encounter from both perspectives at once and understand, without needing it explained, the full geometry of what had occurred. They watched Nancy extend her military common access card through the window. They watched Webb examine it and hand it back. They watched Nancy state her rank, her station, her birthplace, and the legal basis for her objection, clearly, calmly, in full sentences, her hands visible on the wheel throughout. They watched Webb step back and key his radio. They watched the backup unit arrive. They watched the afternoon light move across the hood of a black SUV parked on a Florida highway for 2 hours and 17 minutes while its driver, a decorated naval officer with a federal security clearance, waited for an agency to finish detaining her without cause. The footage did not require narration. Diane provided none. For 2 days. She had prepared with the same methodology she applied to everything that mattered, thoroughly, without shortcuts, with attention to the difference between what was important and what was merely interesting. She walked the jury through the stop in chronological order, using the precise, unhurried language of someone who had been constructing this account since the moment it began. She cited the specific legal standards against which each of Webb's actions failed. She described what it felt like, in the bodily and the constitutional sense simultaneously, to hold credentials that the federal government had spent 8 months verifying and to watch them be treated as insufficient by an agent of that same government because of a determination he had made before he reached her window. On the second day, Diane asked her to describe what her oath meant to her. Nancy was quiet for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give it accurately. She said that she had taken an oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That she had taken it seriously for 12 years. That she understood it to mean something specific and binding, not as a formality but as a framework, a set of protections she had agreed to uphold because she believed they mattered, because she had watched what happened to people in places where they didn't exist. And that sitting on the shoulder of a Florida highway while an agent violated the Fourth Amendment she had sworn to defend was not an abstraction or a policy disagreement. It was a personal breach. It was the institution she served telling her, through the actions of one of its agents, that the oath ran in one direction. She said she had decided it ran in both. The jury deliberated for 5 days. When they returned, their faces carried the expression of people who had spent considerable time with difficult material and arrived at a conclusion the material had ultimately made unavoidable. Guilty on all counts. Damages, $15,600,000. Nancy sat still when the foreperson read it, her hands folded on the table in front of her, her expression the expression of someone receiving information they had worked toward for 18 months and were now allowing themselves, carefully, to believe. She did not leave the Navy. People had expected her to, had assumed, with the logic of people who had not spent 12 years inside an institution learning its texture from the inside, that the verdict would function as an exit, a clean break, a before and after with the courthouse as the dividing line. Nancy understood the assumption. She did not share it. Leaving would have required her to believe that the Navy was the problem. The Navy was not the problem. A federal agent who had looked at a black woman on a Florida highway and made a determination before he reached her window was the problem. A system that had authorized a checkpoint stop without the legal architecture to conduct it responsibly was the problem. The oath Nancy had taken at 22 years old, to support and defend the Constitution, to bear true faith and allegiance to the framework that was supposed to protect every person standing on American soil regardless of what they looked like or where their family had come from, that oath was not the problem. That oath was, if anything, the reason she was still standing. She stayed. She recommitted. She went back to Naval Air Station Jacksonville and stood her watches and attended her briefings and did the work that 12 years had taught her to do with the thoroughness her family's 4 generations of service had established as the only acceptable standard. 6 months after the verdict, her promotion to commander was confirmed. Captain Marsh called her in and delivered the news with characteristic directness, no ceremony, no extended commentary, just the facts in the order that mattered. The promotion had been earned, the timing was correct, and the expectation going forward was that Nancy would do with the new rank precisely what she had done with every rank before it. Nancy said thank you and meant it and walked back to her office and sat for a moment with the weight of it, not the title, but what the title represented. The institution, imperfect and tested and still worth working inside, had looked at the full picture of who she was and confirmed that she belonged exactly where she had always said she did. She was the first officer in her unit's history to have won a federal civil rights case while on active duty. She intended not to be the last. The Kelly Military Civil Rights Fund was incorporated that autumn. A significant portion of the settlement, she declined to specify the figure and the specificity was not the point, went into an endowment designed to do the one thing that the system had most consistently failed to do for people in uniform, tell them what rights they had, and stand behind them when those rights were violated. 3 attorneys, dual-credentialed in constitutional and military law. A case intake process that was free, accessible, and designed without the prerequisite that a potential client already know whether their situation qualified for legal protection, because Nancy understood, from 2 hours and 17 minutes on a Florida highway and from 12 years before that the people who most needed the fund were precisely the people least likely to walk in already certain they deserved it. The seminar she launched the following spring filled every session and grew a waiting list that she resolved by adding sessions and then adding more. 90 minutes. What the Fourth Amendment actually required at a checkpoint. The difference between an administrative warrant and a judicial warrant. The specific federal protections that existed for active duty military personnel and that no one had ever explained to most of the people in the room. How to document an encounter from the first moment of contact and why documentation was not paranoia but preparation. How to be fully compliant and fully legally conscious simultaneously, how to say, clearly and on the record, exactly what was happening and exactly why it was wrong, in the level tone of someone who understood that the camera was their ally and the law was their armor. She taught it the way her great-grandfather had taught her father, and her father had taught her, not as theory but as practice, not as abstract principle but as specific usable knowledge that belonged to the person in front of her as much as it had ever belonged to anyone. The marker was installed in December. Bronze, modest, flush to the ground at the shoulder of the two-lane highway outside Jacksonville where she had sat for 2 hours and 17 minutes with her hands on the wheel and the dashcam rolling and the flags moving in the warm Florida wind. The installation was quiet. The people who came were the people who had stood beside her through the 18 months between the checkpoint and the verdict, and their presence was its own form of testimony that Nancy received without ceremony and with genuine gratitude. The marker read, "A United States naval officer stopped here." She did not stop. She stood in front of it for a moment in the December light. Long enough to let the truth of it land completely. Then she walked back to her car, pulled onto the highway heading north, and drove past the marker without slowing. She passed it every time she left the base. Every time, the same thing, a glance, a recognition, and then forward. Because the work it pointed to was not behind her on a Florida roadside. It was ahead of her, in the funds open cases and the seminars waiting list, and the junior officer who had stopped her in the corridor last week and said, quietly, that she had not known she had those rights until someone told her. Nancy had looked at her and said, "Now you know. Tell the next person." That is how legacies actually work. Not in verdicts or markers or settlement figures, though those matter, and Nancy had made sure they mattered in the most durable way available to her. But in the knowledge that passes from one person to the next, in the room where someone learns for the first time that the Constitution they swore to defend was always meant to defend them back. If this story moved you, if Nancy's 12 years of quiet preparation meeting that Florida highway and refusing to be reduced by it meant something to you, then this is the moment to hit that like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you haven't already, and turn on the notification bell, because the next story is coming and it involves the wrong person being pushed too far and what happens when a system finally meets someone who has been ready for it their entire life. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what part of Nancy's story stayed with you. I read every single one, and your words matter more than you know. Until next time, stay informed, stay documented, and never forget that the rights you carry are only as powerful as your willingness to use them. See you in the next one.